Hey guys, welcome back and Happy New Year. In this episode, we're going to get the axles finished so that we can have a rolling chassis. Alright, so first things first, we need to get rid of this little piece right here. This is supposed to be a guard plate that goes over the transfer case. I'm going to be making a new one of those from scratch later. I need it out of the way so I can have access to drill a hole in here and here so that we can mount this in a better position. Alright, so next thing I have to do is cut the excess die cast off of the base plate there. Ended up getting hung up on the fence of the bandsaw, but I was able to come back with the disc sander and smooth up the edge of it. Because of the awkward shape of this thing, I wasn't able to use the vise that I typically use with my drill press. So I ended up having to install it into this one and did a little bit of leveling to make sure that my hole would come out nice and straight, because this was kind of a do it once and not really get a chance to do it again sort of situation. Drilling it was pretty easy using the carbide bits. As you can see here, I'm not completely in the material because of that little bit of overhang. If I were to have used a general purpose drill bit, it would definitely have flexed and I wouldn't have gotten a nice straight cut on the hole. To drill the hub, I super glued it in place and then ran the drill bit back through the hole that I already did to create a pilot hole in the hub. But because of the shortness of the carbide bits, I ended up having to go back through with a general purpose drill bit, but because the hole is piloted, it made the effort pretty easy. Just run it through nice and slow, try not to warp the bit, and you get a result that is pretty good. And then to get it out, just break that super glue loose. Installing it over the paint made it so that it didn't get a nice permanent stick, and I got a good even hole right through the hub. Alright, got the rear end cut down to the length that I need it, so it will fit up in here and leave me some space to create the new transfer case in a bit. But first I want to get the rear axle installed. So here's the outer portion of the rear axle. I have installed the new articulation point for the axle. I'm going to actually leave this old chunk in there. The reason why is because it adds a little bit of stability, like fore and aft, so that this thing doesn't wiggle around as much. But I need to create two small posts to go in this end and then another small post to go in this end. I can't run one completely through it because it has a solid axle shaft, and that kind of interrupts the ability to run a solid piece through there. So cut some little brass tubes and get this squared away so we can mock this up to get the front one built. Alright, so the first thing I need to do is make a measurement, make sure I get the length of tube right, and take that length and apply it to the other pieces of tubing that I'm going to be stacking inside the larger outside tube. Again, this process is to give me more added strength. For cutting, you can use a small tool like this. It's a miniature pipe cutter. But for the smaller tubes, I recommend using an X-Acto blade. Just line it over where you want to make your cut and roll the tube under the blade, keeping everything nice and straight. Most times you'll get a clean cut, but on occasion you won't. And the ones that don't come out clean, you can take and clean the ends up with a file. To help slide the tubes together, I recommend chamfering the edge of it. Basically, you're going to take and create a almost coned profile. That should help it slide into the thicker piece of tube with ease. Once that's done, apply some glue. If you put too much on, try to get it off so you don't stick your fingers to the tubing, and then collapse it down. I'll show that again here. If it doesn't go in all the way, try to pop it in before it cures. Let's mock it up, see how everything looks. End tube in. As you can see, it kept a more even profile. Put the pivot point where it's supposed to be, it keeps everything nice and lined. and both axles match up. Alright, for the front axle, I can't really use it as is. I got to do some modification of this, but luckily it fits at the right height, so I just need to fill in the top of this. So this was never intended to be seen on the original model, so I need to add a tube so that I can run the axle through it, and then I need to fill all this in with putty and start shaping it out to make it look like the rest of the axle. First I need to cut this brass tube down to length, leave myself a little bit of excess on the ends, and then I can take and grind that down later when I'm sure I've got it the width that I want it. Just got myself about to make a mistake. I was going to super glue this in here, but it's one more step we need to do here before we can mess with this. It's get rid of the paint. So let's do that now. Stuff I've been using is just this. It's a citrus-based paint remover, not as fast as the other chemical paint removers, but it's less noxious. I can use it indoors without fuming myself out. So it says no harsh fumes. I don't think it's non-toxic though. And I would imagine that you're probably not supposed to put this down the drain, so you can put it in the trash without having to worry about melting a hole in your trash can. But as always, adhere to your local municipal guidelines for disposal. Don't need a whole ton of this stuff. Alright, let that sit for a bit. Alright, let's see how this stuff did. I left this for quite a while. This stuff doesn't work as quick as the more toxic, noxious stuff, but you get the added benefit of being able to breathe freely around this. I left this for a couple hours. I actually went and had lunch and then watched a little TV with the wife. But once it gets itself under the paint, it actually starts moving pretty quickly. I've seen this stuff work as quickly as 20 minutes depending on the paint. Norscot on their newer models seems to use pretty good paint, and this one took a minute to get under there and start going, but as you can see, it's coming off pretty easily. You don't really need to drown it in this stuff, just get a good layer over, and then you can scrape it off. I like using these real cheapo brushes because they have a more rigid bristle, and then just brush the excess paint away. Don't just immediately take and rinse this part off, because what will sometimes happen is you'll rinse the chemical right off of the paint, and then it kind of gives the paint a break, and it sometimes will re-adhere, if that makes any sense. So basically you kind of interrupt the process, or you basically save the paint from being peeled off by rinsing this stuff off of there. I have gotten this stuff on my skin, and like on fingertips and stuff like that, it didn't really feel much, but I did get like a little drip on the back of my hand. Didn't quite realize it, and about 5 minutes later there definitely was a burning sensation. So advisable to use gloves if you're going to get real handsy with this stuff. I'm trying my very best to not get my hands up in it. Let's see, we'll flip it over here. Kind of created a little vacuum seal down. Alright. I'm going to continue brushing this off of here, and then I'll go give this stuff a nice little rinse. And you can either do a second coat to try to get the last little bit that's down in there, or you can take like a tool and scrape the remaining paint off there. I'll evaluate that when I get to it. And this is what we're left with. Not too bad. Not perfect, but not too bad. Because this stuff is water soluble, if you're going to go for a second coat of it, make sure you get it completely dry, because any remaining water that's on here will start a deactivation process, because this stuff is water soluble. But I'm not going to do a second coat because this is actually pretty weakened up. I'm just going to use the tool or my fingernail. I'm just going to scrape the rest of it off. Alright, got this thing all cleaned up, nice looking. Ground off the front tabs that I'm not going to need because we're going to make new ones. So now I need to install the axle shaft in there. First I'm going to rough it up a little bit so that the super glue works a little bit better. That's actually to make the super glue stick better. The super glue will work the same, but this will give it a little bit more adhesion. Alright, now that this is glued in, let's fill in all this open space with some putty. It's best to use a two-part putty for something like this. If you use a one-part putty, they basically depend on oxygen or air to cure the putty, so you'll get a cured outside skin, but everything on the inside will still be raw. You don't want that. You can use epoxy as long as it is a firm epoxy. You don't want to use something runny because then it's just going to flow out of any unsealed areas that are in there. I think I've used this previously in some other episodes. This stuff's called epoxy clay. It was recommended by another channel that I like to watch, and it seems to be holding up pretty well. I've used other stuff in the past like Milli Putt, and there's another brand, I can't recall what it is, but both of them I don't have anymore because they hardened up so much in the time that I hadn't been using them, and I had to throw them away. But this stuff seems to be pretty shelf stable. So let's get this stuff mixed up and put in there. With all two-part things, you want to make sure both parts are even. And also, if you used one part to scoop, make sure you clean it off before you go use it to scoop the other part, so you don't end up contaminating it, getting little hard spots where it cures up. Alright, getting it all blended up here. This probably shouldn't be going on my bare hands, but I guess I'll learn that one the hard way. Hopefully not. Mush it together, roll it out, mush it more. Got the stuff mixed up pretty nicely here. And start packing it down in there. I'm going to break it into pieces to pack it in. Make it a little bit easier to work with. Got to ensure a good bond. Stuff it down in. Doesn't need to be pretty initially, but to decrease the amount of time you have to spend cleaning things up later, it's a good idea to do as much cleanup now as you can while it's still soft. Alright. It's blended in well enough for my needs right now. I'm going to let this stuff cure up, and then I'll probably hit it with some more putty later. Alright, it's been about 24 hours and this stuff is hard as a rock. It's time to start shaping it down and making it look the way we want it to look for the final result here. But before I do that, I want to give myself a little bit of a reference point. I've already gotten this pretty round, but to keep everything squared away, I'm going to take and draw a line, basically the top half of this circle here, to give myself a visual reference point so that I can start sanding it down and getting it nice and even. Another thing you can do if you want to make it even easier on yourself, I don't care too much because this part is going to be hidden under the top of here, but you could also create a jig for it. Basically just a flat piece of material, cardboard, brass, plastic, whatever you want, and put in the curve that you're expecting to get as your final result, so that way you could keep setting that down over the top of this, and then that will allow you to kind of set up a reference point. I don't really care, I just need it to look good from the front. So it doesn't need to be like perfectly round or anything, it just needs to, from a distance on display, look even and not wonky. The thing I really like about this putty is it is very firm, but it's really easy to work with. Filing it and marking it makes it kind of ideal for this sort of work. As I work along it, I like to redo my marks if I need to make sure everything is going along as even as possible. Using a little rotary tool to help smooth it out. Not too aggressive of a bit, because you don't want to rip through this stuff and have to redo it. And then constantly you're checking to make sure that everything is staying lined up. For finer details, it's a good idea to mount it into a vise so that you can use two hands to control it. But then there comes a time where you need to put the power tools down and use a hand tool to get those finer details at the end. Alright, so that looks pretty good. Now it is time to attach it to the bottom of here. As you can see, we have a bit of a problem. There's nowhere to attach this. So we're going to have to actually make an attachment point using a little tap here. Get it out. Then if you have a tap, it should come with a drill bit, because the size hole that you drill for the tapping job is a little bit different than the size hole you would drill to install the bolt that you want to tap the hole for, or the screw that you want to tap the hole for. So if you're going to buy a tap or a tap set, make sure it comes with the right size drill bit for the matching tap. To space this thing out, because it's not going to sit completely, well, I should say the screw mounting points don't sit completely flush with the bottom here. I'm going to use a little bit of tubing to space that out. I've measured out the distance that I need, and it's 2.5 millimeters. They actually have little tools that you can use to hold piping just the right length so that you can cut it, or tubing just the right length so you can cut it. I don't have one of those tools, so I'm going to be using this guy. Again, this isn't the recommended way of doing this, and you can actually wear down the points on here, but I'm going to cheat and just score a line in that way. Use the pipe cutter here to cut my initial one because it's thicker brass tubing, and then I'm going to slide that one over the thinner brass and use it to align my next cut so I can stack the two together. And see how they drop right down inside there, and add a little spacer. Next, needed to install the holes for the threading that we're going to do here in a bit, or the thread tapping. Again, make sure you use the bit that came with the tap. And you want to make sure you use a handheld tap driver. You don't want to try to mount this into your drill bit or your power drill, because you will ream the hole out. Just keep nice even pressure. Needed to make some custom size screws here, so just cut them with my miniature hacksaw, and then used a very fine side cutter to trim away any excess flashing or any of the threads that didn't get cut evenly. Then use a small file to cone the end of it out so that you can install the screw nice and even. And bada bing, it all fits together nice and evenly. And we now have a rolling, moving chassis. Articulates, and it rolls, and it's actually level. I'm stoked on it. This is pretty cool. I wasn't sure how I was going to get this to work. I wasn't even sure if I was going to be able to screw it in place, but luckily it worked out. It all worked out pretty darn well. Not as square as it should be, but I think once everything is installed and in place, it will look the part. It even articulates in the back as it should. Really pleased with how this turned out. And yes, I know one of the tires is backwards. I was putting these back together, and I didn't realize that I didn't line that one up. But yeah, really stoked with it. I'll get you guys a level shot so you can see it from the side. Not too shabby. Something very satisfying about rolling this around right now. Alright guys, well that is it for this episode. Sorry it was a shorter one, but you know how these things go. On the next episode, I think it will be time to finish off all the detailing down here. Well, just the basic detailing, getting all these lines cleaned up, getting all this stuff smoothed out, and then I would like to install the articulation hydraulics so that I can move forwards on the rest of this project. Let's install that faceplate. There we go. See you guys next time. Rolling chassis so that we can start building the rest of the model. Now if this is glued in, it's gonna